So to review a little bit from the last video, all of your blood cells are produced inside the red bone marrow, and they all begin with hematopoietic stem cells. These guys divide like crazy, and when they divide, the resulting cells can either become myeloid stem cells or lymphoid stem cells. Lymphoid stem cells will always become some sort of lymphocyte. There are multiple types of lymphocytes, but we will kind of pause to dig in deeper on that until we get to the immune system and the lymphatic system. And myeloid stem cells can produce all the rest of these. That means the other kinds of white blood cells, so monocytes, neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils, all come from myeloid stem cells. It means megakaryocytes, which are the cells that create platelets. Those come from myeloid stem cells. And also erythrocytes, or red blood cells. Those are going to come from myeloid stem cells too, and they undergo an interesting process by which they fill up with a protein that carries oxygen called hemoglobin, and then eject their nucleus, and then they become a final adult erythrocyte. Now, all of this process of making blood cells is called hematopoiesis or hemopoiesis. Either is correct. But this specific type of hemopoiesis, where you're producing erythrocytes, is called erythropoiesis. And erythropoiesis is stimulated by a hormone called erythropoietin, which makes sense. Sometimes that's shortened to EPO. Erythropoietin, as you may remember from chapter 16, is a hormone produced by the kidneys in response to low blood oxygen levels or hypoxia. So things that can stimulate release of EPO are anemia, meaning lack of effective blood cells, lack of oxygen in the blood, decreased blood flow to the kidneys, decreased oxygen content of the air in the lungs, right? So that could be disease or high altitude, right? If you move to Denver or somewhere in the Rockies, you may need to more effectively move oxygen because of the altitude, and that lack of oxygen in your lungs will cause production of EPO from your kidneys. Also, if you have damage to the respiratory surface of the lungs, so if you have some sort of emphysema, something like that, can cause an increase in the amount of red blood cells that you have. This is why a lot of athletes will train in high altitude environments, or sometimes, if you think like Lance Armstrong or most of the cyclists of that generation, who went and did blood doping to increase their efficiency of oxygen transport. There are a couple ways to do that. One is to just take red blood cells out of your body, freeze them, and then a couple months later shoot them back in so that you have too many red blood cells. But another way is to shoot yourself with erythropoietin, or EPO, and that will cause erythropoiesis, or the production of red blood cells. Platelets are just cell fragments involved in the clotting process. They are formed from megakaryocytes, which are very large cells in your red bone marrow that break off these fragments, and those are just continually being replaced. The study of blood and blood-forming tissues and the disorders that are involved in that is called hematology. And blood can be important as a diagnostic tool. You can detect a lot of different things about your body by looking at someone's blood. One of the things that's useful to look at when you're looking at someone's blood is the number and type of blood cells. So you can do a complete blood count, which essentially just says, how many red blood cells do you have? How many white blood cells do you have? How much hemoglobin do you have? Hematocrit, things like that. And if your hematocrit is low, or your red blood cell level, then that can tell you that you may be anemic or something like that. If your white blood cell content is high, that might tell you that you have an infection. But you can also do a differential count, which is a little more complicated, but it involves not just saying how many white blood cells do you have, but how many of each type of white blood cell do you have. So this would be a differential count, right? It tells you what percentage of your white blood cells are neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. Now this is a typical sort of level of a differential count. And I want you to know these different types of white blood cells, and I want you to know which is most and least common in what order. So one way to remember that for me is never let monkeys eat bananas. Never let monkeys eat bananas. Just gets wild. Neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. Neutrophils by far the most common. Basophils by far the least common. In fact, between neutrophils and lymphocytes, it's the vast majority of white blood cells that you'll find in the body. They're very, very common. Basophils, pretty rare. But neutrophils are pretty general. They tend to attack a lot of different bacteria. So if you have a bacterial infection, you may notice by noticing the neutrophils have skyrocketed. Basophils cause inflammation. So if you have a lot of basophils, you could be seeing inflammation. Eosinophils tend to fight off larger pathogens like parasites, right? So if you have like worms or something, you will have eosinophilia, which is an excess of eosinophils, and that differential count could put you on the track to looking for a parasite. Erythrocytes, or red blood cells, are very, very numerous in your body. They make up about a third of all of the cells in your body. And if you take a single drop of blood, it contains over 250 million red blood cells, 260 million. They are unique cells in that they are a biconcave disc, meaning they're like, so there are these like tire-looking things that if you break your tailbone and it really hurts to sit, you can sit on them, and they're like a tire rim around the outside, and they're thin fabric in the middle. That's essentially what red blood cells look like. Right? They're concave on both sides of the middle, and they're thick around the outside. Part of the reason for that shape is they're anucleate. They're one of the only kinds of cells in your body that does not have a nucleus as an adult cell. They don't have most organelles, including ribosomes, because why would you need to make proteins if you don't have DNA to code with proteins? At least as adults, they don't. And because of that, they can't repair themselves, and they only live 3 or 4 months, about 120 days. Now, this weird shape does allow them to do a few different things, right? The fact that they're sort of flatter gives them a larger surface area to volume ratio, which is really important when it comes to exchanging gases. They also can form stacks called Rolo. Yes, like Rolo, the candy, right? You all have a homework assignment. It's to eat some chocolate and caramel candies. And those stacks allow them to move in large amounts, especially through very, very small blood vessels. Capillaries are only thick enough for the width of a single red blood cell at a time, so these stacks help them move in larger quantities. And they're also flexible, so if they're moving through a very small vessel, they can sort of fold like a taco, and get through there so they don't cause clot. Now, this is an actual image from a microscope that's in your book showing these stacks of red blood cells moving through a capillary. This is the nucleus of the endothelial cells that are around the outside of the capillary. Really, erythrocytes are just big sacs of a protein called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin accounts for 95% of the intracellular proteins of a red blood cell, and its main job is to carry oxygen and occasionally carbon dioxide, and so that's the main job of a red blood cell. Hemoglobin itself is made up of 4 polypeptides that come together into one very large protein, and each of those polypeptides have a heme group in the middle. And the heme group has an iron molecule in there, and iron is able to grab onto oxygen pretty effectively. We know this because iron oxide is rust, and if you leave iron out in the weather, it's going to oxidize, grab onto oxygen. When the iron molecule of a heme group within hemoglobin binds to oxygen, we call that oxyhemoglobin. And that's reversible, so the oxygen isn't there forever. It can break back off, and then it becomes deoxyhemoglobin. And so hemoglobin is a very good molecule to pick up oxygen in your lungs and then drop it off at your tissues. Every red blood cell contains about 280 million hemoglobin molecules. Each hemoglobin molecule contains 4 heme units, each of which can grab a molecule of oxygen. So we are talking about over 1 billion molecules of oxygen for each red blood cell. Remember, it's 250 million red blood cells in each drop of blood. We are talking about a lot of oxygen. 98.5% of oxygen is carried to the blood, bound to hemoglobin. And that's because of oxygen, O2, because they're the same atom, they have a nonpolar covalent bond between one another, which means that they're hydrophobic, doesn't dissolve in water very well at all, and so we require hemoglobin to move it through our blood. Because red blood cells don't have a nucleus and can't repair themselves, they have that limited lifespan, and so we have to continuously replace them. About 1% of your circulating red blood cells are replaced every single day. Again, they're produced in the red bone marrow, and they end their lives in the spleen, usually, sometimes the liver, when they are engulfed by macrophages as they get old. Your erythrocyte begins as a hematopoietic stem cell and then a myeloid stem cell, but ultimately it will become a proerythroblast, which is a normal-looking cell, which will then begin to produce hemoglobin, and you can see the cell getting sort of redder as it produces more hemoglobin. This normoblast will eject the nucleus and become a reticulocyte, which is almost an adult red blood cell, and once it's full of hemoglobin, it becomes a adult red blood cell erythrocyte moving through the body.